Well, good morning, everybody. Hopefully you all can hear me. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today. My name is Rachel Vesputa. I am the Tri-State SARE Project Director. I just wanted to kick us off with a little bit of housekeeping details. Today's webinar is being recorded. It will be posted for further reference on our website after some editing. So you can certainly go ahead and take a look at that for future reference. The breakout rooms will not be recorded, just so that everybody knows that piece of information. In an effort to decrease any background noise, I do ask you to please mute yourself now. And of course, we welcome you to unmute yourself and encourage you to unmute yourself during our breakout sessions. Also, we welcome you to use your video. Certainly you don't feel like you have to keep that on while we're all in the main group, but we do, again, encourage you to use that during the breakout sessions as well. And if you haven't already, please pull up the chat box. It should be, if it's there, it should be populated on the right side of your screen. If it is not there, go ahead and scroll down to the bottom right corner and you should see a little icon that says chat. Once you click on that, it should come up on your screen. That's how we're going to communicate today, so feel free to post any questions in there that we can get answered for you throughout the webinar. And we will also be using that for our pre and our post evaluation survey that we'll be taking in just a few minutes. There'll be a link. You can click on that link and then it will take you to an external site. Also, if you're having any trouble with something or cannot find something, feel free to email Frances. Her contact information was in the email that was sent to you with the link to connect today. Just a little bit of information about our project itself. This webinar is part of the Tri-State SARE Professional Development Project. It is funded through the USDA and Northeast SARE. It's a collaborative project among the universities of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. We're in our second year of a 3-year project, and we're focusing our efforts on pasture management and infrastructure for sustainable livestock production. So we're offering a webinar series this year that relates to soil health and pasture livestock, where this is our second webinar and of 3 in the series. And it will consist today of several presentations and some exercises that we'll conduct in a breakout sessions. Those exercises, it was a blank worksheet, were emailed to you with the link again to connect today. So if you're interested in printing it off, certainly go ahead and feel free to do that. If you'd like to use your computer and type in some notes, you're also welcome to do that as well. There's nothing you'll need to do in order to get into your breakout sessions. Just be sure you stay connected and we'll move you in and out of them. And I would just like to make sure everybody is aware of the certificate of participation that our project is offering this year. For those on the line today who were part of webinar 1, you are still eligible. A participant needs to attend all 3 of our webinars and also attend one of the following, or do one of the following rather. Either attend one of our summer workshops or have a one-on-one follow-up conversation about your participation in our program, what you've learned, what additional guidance you need. You'd be having that conversation with our project facilitator, Jean King. She plans to start reaching out in the next month or so to everybody who was part of our project to get your feedback. We do value that tremendously. It helps us make sure that we are guiding our project in the right direction. So we appreciate any input that you are willing to give us. At this point, I'd like to just turn it over quickly to Joe Bonelli, who is the Connecticut State SARE Coordinator. He's also the PI on our Tri-State SARE project. He's going to provide a quick synopsis of the grants and funding that are available through Northeast SARE. Joe?
Thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. And welcome to the first day of spring a couple of days ago, and hopefully the spring is going to go well and your season is going to go well as well too. And thank you for participating in today's program. As many of you may be aware, Northeast SARE or the SARE program has many grant programs that are available as well as a lot of other resources. I'd like to draw your attention this morning to two particular SARE grants. One is the Farmer Grant Program. So if you're in a farming business, you have an opportunity to apply for up to a $30,000 grant to test an idea with regard to production, marketing, or other farm issues as well too. You are required to have a technical advisor, but again, these are farmer grants. And again, you see here from the chart as well too, the application due date for this year will be late fall. And you can stay tuned to the Northeast SARE website of when that date is going to be available as well too. The other one I want to draw your attention to is the Partnership Grant Program. That's also up to $30,000. And that's where an individual is working with a farmer to test an idea with regard to production, marketing, and other farm issues as well too. So that's basically where an individual is looking to work on a project, but also is must work with a farmer as a collaborator as well. That application is now open. That's currently open as we speak. But the due date, I believe, on the partial grants is April 12th of this year as well too. So that's rapidly approaching. And you see other grant programs that are available that you might be interested in as well. If you have any questions about SARE grants, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Also, lastly, I want to mention that Northeast SARE also has many other resource materials as well too you might find interesting. All the grant programs that have been funded in the past are available for you to review as well too for information. If you're looking to apply for a grant, you can also look at what other grants might have been funded as well that are maybe similar to what you're considering as well too. So a lot of resources, a lot of publications, a lot of fact sheets, a lot of brochures, a lot of good information you might find helpful in your business as well too. So thank you again for participating today. And without further ado, I'll turn it back over to Rachel. Rachel?
Thanks, Joe. I just want to jump into our pre-evaluation questions for today. If you go ahead and check in the chat box now, you should see a link to connect. Click on that link and it will prompt you through a series of questions. As you get to the bottom of the page, you should be able to click and submit your questions. Once that's done, you can join us back in WebEx. I'll give everybody just a minute to take care of that now. All right, so if for some reason somebody had trouble connecting and can't find the questions, just reach out, let me know, and I can make sure I get you connected to be able to answer those at another time. But at this point, we're going to move forward. I'd like to just quickly introduce our speakers for today. The first is Sam Corcoran. She is a postdoc at UMASS. Her research and outreach in agronomy focuses on nutrient management and soil health. And our second speaker today, who actually they'll be working together simultaneously during today's workshop. But Dr. Joe Emenheiser is the Extension Livestock Specialist in Connecticut, and he also teaches livestock production and evaluation courses in the UConn Animal Science Department. His extension, research, and teaching roles focus on livestock industry, economic development, and meat quality improvement. So with that, just give us a moment to switch over and we will let Sam and Joe begin.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And Joe, we didn't chat about this before. Are you okay if I share it from PowerPoint and then you can tell me when you want to advance?
That's what I had in mind. That sounds great.
Okay, great. So let me go ahead and do that. Here we go. Okay. So today we're, of course, going to be talking about the value of soil health and the plant, soil, and animal interactions. So I'd like to start it up by telling you that we're going to focus a little bit more on concept as the group as a whole, and we'll dive into more of those tangible management practices in the breakout groups. So something that I hear really often is, I don't know what to do based on my soil health test results. I hear this from farmers, or I hear it from an agricultural service provider that's gone out and taken a test and they get the information back. And then there's this question of, okay, now what? What do I actually do? So I want to address this because I think that this is a really valid point, and it's something that we're seeing happen in this really active area of research. So in part, this is a translation problem. The science side, we know that this is a translation problem, and there's a lot of active effort so that we can create clearer management practices based on these soil health test results. I think something that's also important to be aware of is many of these individual tests, so I don't mean the cash test, but I mean these individual tests like the ACE soil protein index, soil respiration, active carbon. These tests were developed for research purposes. Their origin story was not one where we thought we might ultimately be making management practice recommendations or decisions based on them. So we are obviously doing that now, but there has been a little bit of a learning curve for both scientists, ag service providers, and farmers to make sense of them. And we're getting closer and closer to that. These tests are also very different from a soil fertility test, which I think just about everyone is very comfortable with. Traditional soil fertility test, you send it into the soil lab and you say, I want to grow this crop. And we say, okay, here's how much phosphorus and potassium you have, calcium, magnesium. Here's how much you need to add in order to grow this crop. And it's very formulaic. And the soil health tests, at least at this current state, are not very formulaic. And so it leads us to the question then of, okay, how do we use these tests? So for me, these are the 4 ways that I think about them. And I think it's important to, when you take your test, have one of these ideas in mind, know how you intend to use it. So the first thing is we can use them as simply a snapshot. What does my soil health look like? You can also think of this like going to the doctor for your routine annual checkup. Maybe you're going to do what they tell you to do, right? We always get told, diet, exercise, get enough sleep. Okay, great. Thanks for the feedback. Maybe I'll do something about it. Maybe I won't. I'm just checking in to see where things are at. Then we can also use them for a diagnostic purpose. For me, this is my favorite way to use these tests. It's more of that problem-solving area. So sometimes I'll hear from a farmer, I have this field and I've reseeded and I have appropriate fertility. I have good grazing management, but it's just not performing. And very often we can use these soil health tests to give us more insight and help us understand what might be going on. It's not a conviction, it doesn't tell us for sure, but it can give us good evidence that we can then start to make management practices for. So on this test that you're seeing here, for example, the overall quality is high. The soil looks really good, but there is a surface hardness problem here and a little bit of a subsurface problem. And so we know that this field might be struggling with some compaction or some water infiltration and uptake that we were able to diagnose by going beyond just a standard fertility test or site visit. Another really valuable use is as risk assessment. So again, we can look at this field and say a risk for us might be trying to establish new plants, or a risk might be, if we're in drought conditions and suddenly we get rain, it might be hard for our plants to access that water if the soil is too hard for that water to move into the soil in the first place. And then the last, which is where a lot of the science is right now, a lot of the research is right now, is monitoring change over time. So I can take a baseline soil health test today. I can make my management practice change this summer. Maybe it's a cornfield becoming pasture. Maybe it's continuous grazing becoming rotational grazing. And I can go back in 3 to 5 years, do another soil health test and see how have things changed. I think that that's also really valuable legacy data for a multi-generational farm or a farm that you're going to be on for decades to create this history of what is going on with your soil health, because it's really going to reflect how you have been farming and managing that land over time. So with that in mind, we can then move into thinking of this concept of soil health. I think most of this was covered in webinar 1, so we'll make it brief. But when we're talking about the concept of soil health, we're talking about this space where physical, chemical, and biological parts of the soil overlap. So physical being things like the sand silt clay ratio or compaction. Chemical being things like your fertility or your pH. And then biological being things like our microbial community. How big is that community? How active is that community? And I think this is where some of that translation problem can be sometimes, is saying, okay, I understand what soil health is, but now when we want to move into this really tangible active management, I think we need to consider these 3 elements a little bit differently. And we need to think about the interactions between them. If I pull a lever on the physical side, how is that going to affect my chemical or my biological components? So that's a little esoteric, but here's an example of biological and chemical. So in this study, there was 2 research sites. One is Frederick, one's Bernieville. And what they were doing is they wanted to know, if we apply nitrogen fertilizer, how does that affect our nitrogen fixing microbes in the soil? So we know that we have a variety of microbes that can take nitrogen from the atmosphere, put it in the soil, and make it available to plants. We would think of that as a biological piece of our soil, which is going to then influence the chemical fertility. So what they found here at both locations is, as you add more and more nitrogen, you get less and less biological activity from these nitrogen fixers. You've essentially outsourced their job, and they're no longer able to compete in the soil. And so this is where we have to start thinking, if I make this change to one component, how is it going to affect the other 2 components? Likewise, when we're thinking about whole farm systems where we have plants and animals and soil to manage, we have to think about, if I manage my plants in such a way, like if I graze them in such a way, how is that going to affect my animal? Or how is that going to affect my soil? So maybe rotational grazing, really high stocking density, maybe we're going to get more compaction, but we're going to get better animal intake and more uniform plant grazing. So today in the breakout groups, that's where we're going to spend a lot of time, is thinking about how these 3 items play together. But before we get into the really nitty-gritty of the soil health tests, I want to take a big step back and just talk about soil organic matter. I would say that if you take nothing else from today or nothing else from me today, look at your soil organic matter. This is the cheapest, fastest, easiest way to get a snapshot or get an understanding of what's going on with your soil health. And it's just a few bucks to add it to a routine soil fertility test. So if the cash test is out of your budget or you're not fully bought in yet, just start with soil organic matter. The reason being is because we know that soil organic matter is highly connected to what's going on with our soil. It is highly connected to how much biological activity you have. It's highly connected to how much fertility you have. And it's really strongly related to features like compaction, water holding, water infiltration. We also know that it takes us a long time to build soil organic matter, but soil organic matter can be lost very quickly. And so as long as you're keeping an eye on this, you can get a pretty good sense of your soil health. So maybe this is where I started to have a little bit too much fun with things, but if you look at somebody and they're saying, my farm looks really good, and you want to know what they're doing, The secret ingredient is absolutely soil organic matter. And I'm going to show you a few more examples of that today. And we're going to talk a lot about how to build and how to take care of and protect that soil organic matter. So put this into context, because I think it's a word that we talk about a lot and don't always break down. When we're talking about soil organic matter, on one hand, we're talking about the living part of your soil, and you can think about this as your soil engine. So depending on the source you look at, this is estimated that somewhere between 5 to 15% of your soil organic matter are living organisms. These are your microbes that are responsible for doing this breakdown and decomposition process of what I'm going to call the recently living. And so that's going to be plant and animal residues. So obviously grass, trampled grass, for example, is very clearly recently living, but now decaying organic matter. But also, grass that went through your cow and came out the back end. It's in a different form, but it's this recently living, and it has these organic molecules. And that's going to serve as our fuel for the soil engine. And so when we see soil organic matter changing, going either up or down, we have to consider that on one part, we're affecting that living fraction, and then on the other part, we're affecting that decomposition pipeline. So just to put a few numbers on this, if we go with a conservative estimate that 5% of your soil is alive, and you have 2% soil organic matter, that's equivalent to about 2,000 pounds of living material per acre, which if you think about it, if you estimate a sheep around 250 pounds, that's like, 8 sheep out there living in the soil of 1 acre. If you're on the high side and you have 8% soil organic matter, that's 8,000 pounds of living material in your soil. That's equivalent to about 32 sheep. And so you really have to think that you're taking care of a below ground herd. And that's why we put so much emphasis on this soil organic matter protection and management. And it'll really pay you back too, because soil organic matter on one part is going to, that decomposing part is going to feed your living herd, but it's going to do things like provide lots of nitrogen and phosphorus. It's going to help you with compaction and erosion and really lead you on the path to that healthy soil concept that we're trying to get to. And so I think, Joe, I'll turn it over to you if you want to talk a little bit about how we can use then our grazing management to build up that soil organic matter.
Thank you for the opportunity to jump in on this, and I'll keep it brief with an eye on time. But we think about soil, plant, and animal interactions as a cycle, and the reality is that we can take any two of those steps and think about a linear cause and effect. But where we could focus on soil organic matter as an end. It's also a means. It's an animal or a means to plant performance. It's a means to animal performance, and vice versa. And so think about where to break into this and make it, hardest hitting and most impactful in terms of grazing management. I think one of the keys is to avoid overgrazing and maintaining that plant health. Certainly is important for animal nutrition, but that's also critical for pasture condition, as we'll show you, or for soil condition, as we'll show you in some subsequent slides. So grazing is going to stimulate the roots and their exudate, and also cause some root dryback. But another aspect that many people don't fully understand or don't value to the extent that they could is trampling. And trampled forage is not necessarily wasted forage if it goes back into the soil and it continues to build the organic matter, which supports the biology. The picture on the right is an example of an overgrazed, very rocky pasture that has pretty poor soil health, likely, certainly poor plant health. And while those cows seem to be in reasonable body condition, we could question the range of performance that we could get out of them too. Next slide. And so this is just an example of two pictures of grazing height. If I were to identify one aspect in the grazing system, that's visible and manageable without a lot of expensive tests, it's grazing height. Now, the appropriate grazing height is going to vary depending on the species of the forage. Every plant has a different root system, a different growing point on the anatomy of the plant, and so forth. But to make this really, really simple, for animals to perform on a system, they have nutrient requirements. And a large part of those nutrient requirements are energy, protein, vitamins, and minerals. If we start with energy, the energy in the entire system comes from the sun. And that's harvested in the way of photosynthesis by the plant. The plant photosynthesizes using the leaves, using the top part of the plant. And so if we allow enough residual leaf material for the plant to photosynthesize, it can continue to harvest energy and not pull that up from the root system. And while it can pull those carbohydrate stores up from the root system, that's going to compromise its growing potential. It's going to compromise the nutrition it provides to the animal, and ultimately it's going to compromise the organic matter that's built in the soil because there's less plant growth that occurs as well. Next slide. And so when we think about grazing management, our goal is to understand how the plants grow, what the animals need, and optimize those things, which in turn is going to benefit soil organic matter and soil quality. And so over the course of the growing season, or the maturity of the plant, the amount of plant material on an acre is going to increase as it becomes more mature. But its quality in terms of digestibility, energy content, protein content, palatability, its quality is going to decrease over time. And, on the third line there, we talked very quickly about carbohydrate and nitrogen storage, and there are some dynamics that occur there. Our goal is to optimize all three of those aspects and to harvest the forage or continue to have animals on the forage in the ideal part of that graph, which is close to the intersection of the quality red line and the forage yield green line. We don't want to allow the forage to get too tall or too mature or its quality decreases. We don't want to graze it too early or its yield is inadequate, and we also have some other effects on the soil we'll talk about. But rotating paddocks to keep animals on forage at the optimal stage of maturity is the key. And once again, trampling residual forage is not necessarily wasteful if it's building organic matter. Next slide.
Perfect. So I think, Rachel, we toss it back to you, and we're in our first breakout group to talk about, okay, how do we actually manage our soil health? What do we do? Oh, I think you're on mute, Rachel.
Rachel, you're on mute.
Thanks, guys. At this point, I think what we'll do is go out into our breakout sessions. If everybody has that worksheet handy, that will be very helpful during our time frame. We have about 20 minutes today, so we'll join back somewhere around 10:50, and it will give you a 60-second warning before we are to leave the breakout session and come back to the main room. And unless anybody has any quick questions, I think we're ready to break out. Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me and everybody had a great first session. If you had outstanding questions or things that you were in the middle of conversation on, there will be some time. We built in some time at the end for some wrap up and some Q&A. We'll also have a second breakout session still, so you guys can pick up where you left off too if that works out better. But at this point, I'm going to shift back to both Sam and Joe to give a second presentation and build on where we just were.
Here we go. Okay. I was so emphatically talking about soil organic matter again, and I was muted. Okay, so if you got to the part where we were, doing the kind of a poll about what are your expectations around soil organic matter building, we intentionally didn't give a sort of quote unquote answer because I wanted to talk about this a little bit. I am always the fun police when someone says, I built my soil organic matter by 1% last season. Isn't that amazing? So I'm not going to go through all of these numbers, but I wanted to put these numbers up there so that you would believe me. And I'm happy to email you with the math after this if you don't believe me. But if you plug in some assumptions, if you wanted to increase soil organic matter by 1%, that would be equivalent to adding in 20,000 pounds of soil organic matter. We can do some math and convert that into carbon because it's a little bit easier to do the math with carbon. And that's equal to about 11 to 12,000 pounds of carbon that you would have to add to your soil. So if you think about something like tall fescue, that is 47% carbon, and you consider that not all residue that you put in actually converts to soil organic matter. It's not like I can put down 1 ton of fescue and all of that carbon converts to soil organic matter. Only 10 to 20% of that residue is actually going to convert into what we classify as soil organic matter. A lot of it is lost back to the atmosphere simply through that breakdown process. So if you shake out all these numbers, it turns out that to increase soil organic matter by 1% using tall fescue, you would have to add 117,000 pounds of fescue to get that 1% increase. That takes a lot of time, right? That's obviously not going to happen in one season. And so when we're talking about building soil organic matter, and when you're looking at increases to your soil organic matter, about a 0.1% increase would be considered good and feasible in 1 year's time. So something else just to keep in mind if you are looking at your soil organic matter as a primary indicator of soil health is that it's funny how sometimes science isn't actually a science. So by that I mean when we're in the lab and we're measuring soil organic matter, there's up to a 1% error rate. That error comes from just field variation. It comes from the quality of the sample. It has to do with the nature of the actual laboratory test itself. And so it's completely reasonable that you might have a test that says 2% this year and 3% next year, but what you're probably capturing is that 1% margin of error. Now, that being said, it takes a long time to build soil organic matter, but it takes very little time at all to lose soil organic matter. One tillage event can burn off a very substantial amount of your soil organic matter. So if it's going down rapidly, it probably is cause for concern. If it's going up rapidly, just be conscientious and be aware that what you're probably capturing is just that variation of the laboratory test and your field sample. The other thing I wanted to hit on is the idea of how much soil organic matter is good. It seemed like, when I first got into agronomy, the hottest thing was who had the biggest tillage radish. And now the hottest thing is who has the most soil organic matter, which is great, but we do know that soil organic matter is good up to a point. And this optimum amount of soil organic matter is going to be different based on your system. So what we're seeing here is on the bottom, on the x-axis, organic matter is going up from 1 to 9. And then on the y-axis, we're looking at above ground biomass production. And what we see on this very top line, this green line, is that in a system that has nitrogen and has plenty of water added, about 5% organic matter results in the best plant performance, the best yield. But if we look at this orange line, for example, where there's no added nitrogen, but there is plenty of water, which I think is often, characteristic of a lot of our New England farms, more like 6 to 7% of soil organic matter might be ideal. But we also see that at a certain point, once we start going up to those 8-9%, we start to have problems. So here, maybe that's good news for your soil, maybe that's good news for your soil microbes, but we can have issues with your plant's actual ability to succeed and be productive, which is then of course going to affect how much food your animal has to eat. So when we're focusing on this, again, there's a framework, and 5% might be feasible if you have, a high clay soil, but that might be out of the question if you have a really sandy soil. So there's a lot of variation when we're talking about what does good mean, what does ideal mean. Another thing I wanted to hit on is that our soil organic matter, one of the reasons that we really want to prioritize protecting it and building it is it's an excellent source of fertility for your fields. So for every percentage of soil organic matter that you have in your field, we know that we get, depending on a lot of like weather conditions, water, temperature, you're going to get between 10 to 20 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the season and 1 to 2 pounds per acre in the season. So something that I hear from farmers a lot is I never fertilize and my pasture looks great. And I always want to know, okay, what's your soil organic matter look like? So on this left, and these are two pictures taken approximately the same time of year, both organic farms, both rotational grazing, and in the same county. So on the left side, there's about 2% soil organic matter. That's going to release about 20 to 40 pounds of nitrogen in the season and about 2 to 4 pounds of phosphorus. And that's not enough to support plant growth. That's not enough to, sustain, a long-term grazing program. And that soil is just, it can't support an organic farm that maybe is not able to, of course, put in synthetic fertilizer. And we know that compost and manure and things like that can be very expensive. Whereas on the right side, this field has close to 7% soil organic matter. So I know that they're going to get between 70 to 140 pounds of nitrogen per year from that soil organic matter. That is substantial. I mean, that you really can support that pasture just on this nutrient release from your soil organic matter. It's also going to get about 7 to 14 pounds of phosphorus per year, which again is in that neighborhood where we'd like to see it. And so this person on the right, if they say, I never fertilize and my pasture looks great, I believe that because I can understand that there is that soil organic matter there providing that fertility to support the system. So we know that these fertility inputs are going to directly relate to the nutrient content in your forage. So we can't have nutrients in our forage that we don't have in our soil in the first place, right? The good old, matter cannot be created or destroyed. So soil organic matter can directly provide nitrogen and phosphorus. It's not a substantial provider of things like calcium, magnesium, potassium, but what it can do is affect your soil chemistry in such a way that it's easier for that calcium, magnesium, and potassium to be available in your soil for your plants. And so again, especially in an organic system, and we have so many organic farms, and I also think this upcoming year, due to political events, it's going to be an expensive fertilizer year. Having this soil organic matter because you focused on soil health is really going to eliminate some of those risks and some of those expenses of trying to provide fertility. So I will just again note that soil tests do not report nitrogen. That has to do with some funky soil chemistry reasons that I would love to talk to you about if you want to. But again, you can add for a couple of bucks soil organic matter and use those estimates based on percentage nitrogen. And so here, I think I'll also turn it back over to Joe. You can let me know if you want to finish off on this slide or pick up on the next one.
No, this looks good. So, again, to follow up on the idea that matter is neither created nor destroyed, and thinking about trying to produce livestock or livestock products off of a system, those outputs are going to require inputs. And, whether whether the livestock are used primarily for reproduction, like they would be in a cow-calf operation, or production of growing body tissues, or producing milk, or producing a product, the deposition of muscle, the deposition of fat. Those things require energy, they require nutrients, and those energetic outputs require inputs. So they come from the forage, they come from the soil. Not necessarily revolutionary concepts, but I think that sometimes we don't think about the whole system to the extent that we need to when we focus, just on soils. And so I threw up two quick slides here from a beef cattle example, cow-calf system. That's, again, not the only example of livestock production, but these are their nutrient requirements throughout the year. And rather than presenting them on a calendar basis, they're presented on months since calving, because the nutrient requirements of animals are going to vary depending on their stage of production and their genetic ability to produce. And so the top slide shows pounds of dry matter that are required. Dry matter is just the plant matter after the moisture has been removed. And in the bottom graph, the blue line is TDN, or total digestible nutrients, essentially energy, percentage of the dry matter, and the pink line is percentage crude protein. Again, on the x-axis, months since calving, and the key takeaway that I want you to see are that those requirements are dynamic throughout the year, and they're going to be dynamic for every species, whether they're used for milk, whether they're reproduction animals, whether they are meat animals. For example, finishing beef cattle requires high energy content, and early growth requires a higher protein content, and there are a lot of just nutritional things that we can talk about. But the dynamics change throughout the year. Understanding how those changes in requirements occur for the animal, and then how to align that with the availability of the forage becomes critically important. And we'll follow up on that on another slide. Go ahead. And so I'm going to let Sam talk about a lot of this, but this is just a very extreme picture of cattle in a drought. But one of the key points that we wanted to make is that as we're trying to align those livestock nutrient requirements with forage availability, and we think about a spike after calves are born, and nutrient requirements increase because of lactation. If that also corresponds with summer, which happens to be a dry summer, and there are drought conditions, the forage availability is going to decrease in that system also as a result. And so trying to find ways to buffer ourselves against the effects of weather patterns becomes pretty critical. And soil organic matter is a key element of providing some resilience against drought. Sam, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, and for those on, we are going to come back to the cash soil health assessments in a minute. We're almost done with our love letter to soil organic matter, but so one of the great things about soil organic matter is, when you're looking at things on your traditional soil health test, and you see things like water holding capacity, that's connected to a couple of different features. But again, soil organic matter is one of those things that is going to affect your water holding capacity. So if you are in a drought situation and you do get some rain, or you had rain earlier in the season, that soil organic matter can help buffer those drought effects, because you're able to hold on water, you're able to absorb water. And so again, if you look at, if we go back to this, this was a very droughty summer. The individual on the left, had low soil organic matter, and you can see that they're also struggling with some drought. That grass is kind of dried up and sad. And on the right, I mean, you just wouldn't even know anything had happened. It looked so good. And when you start to dig into the soil, you can feel and see that moisture in there as well. The other thing where drought and nitrogen interact with each other is that plants really would prefer it if they could take up nitrogen that's dissolved in water. It comes in passively, it doesn't take any energy for the plant, super easy. Plants do have ways to take up nitrogen from the soil when it's dry, but it's difficult, it's not as effective, and it takes energy for the plant to be able to do that. So if we have, we get into these really compounding effects of, oh, it's dry and we don't have a lot of fertility. And then that, of course, is going to translate to decreased protein in the forage. And as Joe was talking about, less protein, we're going to have, we're going to see slower rates of gain and lower animal conditioning. And then on the other hand, and this is where I'll kick it back to Joe to talk a little bit about nitrate toxicity. When plants get stressed out, especially grasses and a few other things like spinach can do this, they really need that water to be able to take that nitrogen and turn it into things like protein once it actually gets into the plant. So if the grass can't do that, it ends up storing nitrogen in the form of nitrate, which can lead to nitrate toxicity in animals. And Joe, can you talk a little bit about what happens with nitrate toxicity?
Yeah, I mean, without getting too far into the weeds, essentially, it's just going to be a decrease in performance or overall health that results from consuming forages that are high in nitrates. And so just to keep it safe and to keep it simple, let's say, we'll do what we can to buffer the soils against drought conditions. And we might have to consider other issues or other aspects like managing our stocking rates or so forth if we're faced with drought conditions that we can't deal with. And this go into a long tangent again, with the effects of drought on animals needing to travel greater distances to consume water, being heat stressed, compounded with nitrates toxicity. All of those things are going to result in decreases in performance or less of their dietary energy being allocated toward production. And none of those things are ideal for a system. So bottom line, protect the soils against drought to the extent that we can.
Great. So, okay, here we go. As promised, your cash soil health test. So on this, I wanted to now start to talk a little bit about some of these other big features that we think about when we're talking about soil health. So one is compaction. And here, the soil test overall looks really good. This field has a long history of grazing. It's been grazed since I think the 80s. Various managers over time, some better than others, I guess, is one way you could say it. People, and also, right, the recommendations from, let's be frank, Extension have changed over time from the 80s, 90s to present, because we've learned more too. And so this field has, seen best intentions for about 40 years. But, and that's really reflected in things like this nice organic matter of close to 5%, beautiful field. And we see all these nice green boxes. I'm sorry if you are colorblind, but as a note, these also go on a scale from 0 being the lowest to 100 being the highest. And soil protein looks good, respiration and carbon, all of these biological indicators, all of these things look great. But what we see is the subsurface hardness and the surface hardness don't look so great. So when we're talking about surface hardness, we're talking about the top 0 to 6 inches, and then subsurface hardness is 6 to 18 inches. So what's interesting is this field has no recent history of tillage or, aggressive renovation, not much in the way of traffic. And, let me note that. So hardness is just another word for compaction. It's measured in pounds per square inch. You can do this with a penetrometer. They're about $300 to $350. If you do not have one or do not have access to one, then you can just skip putting that information on your little form when you send it off to Cornell. And please don't take soil compaction along the fence line because I very often hear, oh, my hardness, it can't possibly be that compacted. It's so easy to pound posts, but your animals aren't trampling all over your fence line and you're not driving equipment all over your fence line. So there's often, you're going to see not much compaction along the fence line, and you might see a very different soil out in the pasture. So here, for them, this risk is that it's going to be hard for new seeds to establish. It's going to be hard for plant roots to also root deeply. And then it's going to make things tricky for water infiltration. So if you're in a drought year and suddenly you get a little bit of water, you might not be able to capture very much of that water. But here, what we see is, well, we do have all of that organic matter. And so that can kind of save us from this compaction situation because it can balance with, well, maybe you're having trouble getting good water infiltration, but when you do get that water infiltration, you have organic matter to help support holding on to that water that you have gotten. And what's interesting about this field, and what's really interesting when we're thinking about compaction, is what we think, and this is where I say diagnostics are evidence, they're not convictions, is that this field was one time for about a week used as a parking lot for an event on the farm. And we know that a compaction event, when the soil is wet, can take decades to recover from, and in fact, you might never recover from it. And I think sometimes this is why we might sound like a broken record when we talk about grazing management, and especially avoiding grazing on wet soils, because that can lead to these types of compaction consequences that take decades to recover from. So when we're thinking about this in terms of our plant, there's a couple of different ways that compaction can manifest. So on the right side, it's showing you several different forms of compaction. But really, this is important because most plant roots cannot penetrate soils that have greater than 300 psi of resistance and compaction. So plant roots are pretty strong, but everything has a limit. So this means that our plant roots are going to be really limited to that top 6 inches. So again, we know that water moves down the soil profile. We know that nitrogen moves down the soil profile. These roots are not going to be able to go chasing that water and that nitrogen as it moves down in the soil profile. They're going to be really reliant on whatever we have in the top 6 inches. The other tricky thing is when we also have subsurface compaction, yes, eventually that water will move down, but before it does, we get stuck with waterlogged soils, which are not only muddy and problematic for animals, but roots have to breathe. They do take up oxygen. And if you have a waterlogged soil, plant roots can't take up oxygen. And then we can start to see poor plant growth. And we go into that whole cycle of reduced yield. There's less for animals to be eating. But again, back to our good friend soil organic matter, we do have a lot of soil organic matter, almost 5% in the top 6 inches. So that can provide nitrogen and phosphorus to these shallow rooted plants. Joe, do you want to run with stocking density and manure distribution?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll try to move quickly to get us into the breakout groups. But if we think about migratory animals and kind of traditional grazing systems before we introduced property ownership and fence and all the artificial things that we try to manage, large groups of animals, grazing animals, think about bison in the American West, for example. They moved in large mobs together, and they moved quickly over an area and then moved on. And they didn't come back to that area, potentially even within the same grazing system, or within the same grazing season. And so those dynamics, to some extent, are what we're trying to emulate, but obviously we're limited in our acreage and our fence. And and in many cases in the amount of animals that we have. Understanding some of the pluses and minuses of stocking density is going to be pretty key to affecting the plants and eventually the soils. And so on one hand, increasing stocking density gives you better manure distribution. Animals are great manure spreaders that don't require a lot of fossil fuels to do that. And it can improve grazing behavior because there's less opportunity for selection, or there's more trampling of the forages that aren't desired, and so forth. On the other hand, stocking density can increase compaction. So really being in tune with the type of soil, the state of the soil, is critical to that. And a key example, going on right now, the sun is shining, spring has sprung, everybody's itching to get outside, the fields are still wet. And so we can do a lot of permanent damage if we start to graze too early, put too many animals on mud, compromise the ability for the soils to breathe, abilities for the plants to grow. There's going to be differences in species in terms of compaction too. Cattle weigh 10 times what a sheep does. They don't have 10 times bigger feet. And so cattle tend to contribute more to compaction. And some of that is also their grazing behavior, where they're more conducive to wetter areas. Understanding those dynamics and managing them, which we're just scratching the surface of right now, but that's important. Let's see. And so at the end of the day, I think the most important evaluation for early grazing, early in the season, is really understanding how much nutrition is the grass providing, and is that nutrition adequate to justify the potential for compaction. In many cases, it is more valuable long-term for the grazing season, and beyond that, to keep the animals in a little bit longer, feed them a little bit more hay, or keep them in sacrifice areas to make sure that we have some areas that are not as heavily compacted. Go ahead.
Perfect. And now we're on second breakout group. Oh, preview.
All right, before I put everybody into their breakout sessions, I just want to make a quick note that there were some newcomers. There were also some disconnections that resulted in reconnecting. And so there may be a few people who are not in the original breakout group from session 1. So as moderators, if you guys can just kind of make sure that you don't see any new faces and participants. I apologize if you're in a new group, but we will be covering the same content no matter what group you are in. So with that, I think I'm going to shorten this breakout session just a little bit so that we can kind of maintain track. So we'll be in our sessions for about 18 minutes or so, and then we'll join back into the main breakout group. Does anybody have any questions? All right, so I'm going to get us started now.
Man, I don't know about everybody else. I wish we had about 5 or 10 more minutes on that last one.
Well, on that note, Sam, I think what we'll do is we'll switch back over to you and Joe to finish out our presentation. But before I hand it over to you guys, I think maybe what I'll do is encourage everybody to, now that we have no more breakout sessions, post any questions or anything that you want answered into the chat, because we do have time for that. And I'm happy to, once Joe and Sam finish up their presentation, moderate those questions and let any of our moderators answer them. So certainly don't feel like this is the last piece that you have to say something. We'll definitely make sure we get everything addressed. And with that, Sam and Joe, take off again.
Okay, so we're just going to sort of round the bend on just some of the other pieces that we see in our soil health tests a lot and try to put them into a little bit of context. So one thing that we hear, you cannot be a grazer and not talk about summer slump, right? We all know that with our cool season perennial grasses that we grow in New England, they grow beautifully in March through May, and then it starts to get warm and we get into this famous summer slump where pasture productivity just starts dropping sometime in June and bottoms out in September when it's hot. And then we start to see our grass pick back up, as we cool down and move into the fall. So we often connect that to air temperatures, but that's really a factor of soil temperature. As the air is getting warmer, of course, the soil eventually gets warmer, and plant roots just aren't as effective. Let me back up. Cool season perennial plant roots, our grasses, a lot of our legumes, are not as productive and successful in warm soils. So what's interesting is we see the same thing happen with soil respiration. So soil respiration is a measurement or an indication of our soil biology. What it on one hand, it indicates how active our soil biology is, and on the other hand, it indicates how many microbes we have. So you can have a lot of microbes that are not very active, or you can have less microbes that are very active and sort of see the same trend. So I realize it's a little bit of a funky thought, but I just want to differentiate activity versus abundance. And when our soil microbes are active, we're literally measuring that, that CO2 release. There's a few ways to measure respiration, and that tells us how much are they breathing. So just like if you go for a run, you're going to start breathing a lot more heavily because you're more active. Microbes do the same thing. They get busier, they breathe more, and we can measure that. So what's really interesting is we see that soil respiration is the highest. It starts to go up as the soil starts to warm up in May, and it peaks around June, and then it rapidly plummets in July. And that rapid plummet is the same rapid plummet that we see in our pasture grass productivity. And so essentially, if your grasses are struggling, your soil biology is also struggling, and it's a factor of heat, and it's something that we all want to try to manage for, and sometimes the answer is just that there isn't a silver bullet for this. And this is where we start to think of more creative management, and we try things like warm season annuals. We start to look for things that will be able to help this system. Another thing that's going on is when your grasses are slowing down their activity, they're not doing as much photosynthesis. Plants, when they do photosynthesis, of course, they make sugars, and they'll release up to about 30% of those sugars into the soil to feed your microbes. And if you're not doing as much photosynthesis, you're not feeding your microbes as much, and then all of that soil, biology, chemistry starts to slow down. So by doing creative things like integrating warm season annuals, we can put in a plant that's going to be happy and can continue to feed that soil population and keep it active throughout the summer months. And so there, I'll turn it over to Joe for the next slide.
Yeah, so I'll keep this real short and brief. And so I'm going to go back to my point again about understand your animals, understand the number of animals that you have, their weight, how those factors are going to influence their nutrient requirements. And if their nutrient requirements change throughout the year, first and foremost, think about how to align those requirements with the availability of the forage in the system. And so, on this particular example, we've got calendar months on the x-axis, a spring calving system. As cows go into late gestation, early lactation, their nutrient requirements increase early in the spring. Then they start to decrease gradually, but not as drastically as we saw with the summer slump of production. So we need to think about how do we supplement them during the summer slump when their demands exceed the availability. There's 3 simple solutions for livestock management in the summer slump. And one is to provide more feed. It might be supplemental, in terms of hay or grain in that case. Find access to more land, renting more pastures. Both of those things might be cost prohibitive, might not be available. And so the other solution is fewer animals. Okay, but understand that we don't want to reduce animals to the point that we don't have enough when the grasses are performing, that we can't harvest them adequately to keep them growing, or keep the plants growing, keep them photosynthesizing. So really just trying to match those 2 things in tandem is key for avoiding damage all the way around. And if you have animals that you're growing for finishing, and they go through a period of time where their forage availability falls short of their nutrient requirements, that's going to have permanent effects. We might be able to catch them up, but that's likely to have a considerable expense with it, and it's certainly going to delay the time to get them finished to produce a quality product. Okay, so I'll just keep it real simple with this. Make sure that throughout the calendar year, whatever system you're designing, that planning for the worst case scenario, that your availability of forage is going to exceed the requirements for forage, and not just for dry matter, but for all nutrients, energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, all the things that animals require to produce. Next slide.
So
Back to you.
I'll go through that quickly, and then it comes, and then we'll go to Q&A. This is a good example of a diagnostic. This is a field that someone inherited it in the past. The previous owner had done a lot of tillage and had used a lot of various pesticides. Like by pesticides, I mean, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, the whole spectrum. And this individual, he has a great rotational grazing plan, fully bought into soil health, organic, no-till, all of the quote unquote good things you can do. Tried seeding and legumes and just could not get good growth in this field. And so this was a good opportunity to take a diagnostic test. And this is where, I was joking with our group, sometimes you feel like you're reading the tea leaves because you're trying to look at these really intricate things and understand what's going on. Let me give the disclaimer that I think the diagnostic use of these tests is absolutely the hardest way to use these tests. So don't feel bad if this isn't immediately obvious to you. I've had a few years to practice, and it's something you just have to practice. So one of the things that we see right off the bat is, we've got hardness. We have surface hardness and we have subsurface hardness. So this might tell us why he's having trouble getting establishment of new grasses. They're struggling. And then the other thing that we see is, one is poor soil respiration. So from this, I don't know if they're just not very active, and I don't know, or if there's just not very many microbes, if there aren't a lot of critters here. But what I do know is the biology is not very active. In part, yeah, that probably has to do with compaction, means there's not good space and good air that these microbes need. That could be from our history of tillage. We're also learning more and more that the different chemistries used in pesticides, some can certainly, especially things like broad spectrum fungicides, can kill a lot of non-target soil microbes. By that I mean, if you want to kill a bad guy, you might accidentally kill a whole lot of good guys. And so what we might be seeing is just the evidence of a field trying to recover from a history of not being, treated with soil health in mind. We also see low ACE soil protein index. Again, I know it's kind of an abstract one, but we can think of that as a measure of the quality of our organic matter. So even though, we have a decent organic matter, close to 3%, there's not actually a lot of nitrogen in that organic matter. And so our microbes are starving for nitrogen, and they're not able to provide nitrogen to those plants. And so what we're seeing here is this really live time example of, we didn't think about managing soil health in the past. Someone new is trying to manage for soil health, but their plants are struggling. And as a result, they have not yet been able to put animals on this field because they just get such slow growth from their plants that they're afraid that if they put animals on it, it's just going to make problems worse. And so, of course, that has an animal effect because this is less forage that we can feed to an animal. It takes this couple of acres of paddock space out of the rotation plan. So I will give the disclaimer that this test was taken in the summer. And so that isn't the best time to take a soil health test. But it tells us that, in the summer, your soil respiration, your microbes are struggling. It was also pretty dry. And so if your soil respiration is struggling, if your microbes are struggling, your plants are definitely struggling. And so we asked ourselves, what's the solution for this field? On one part, it's time and just staying the course. And, on the other part, it's setting realistic expectations for this field. It's going to be a while before this is going to be a really highly productive field for this farm. And that has to be factored into the rotational grazing plan, that, you're probably not going to go to this paddock as often. It might need a longer rest period. And your stocking duration is probably going to be different because you're not going to have as much forage to graze. And so you're going to be at more risk of overgrazing if you don't factor all of those things in. So with that, I would say these are our take-home messages, for today. Practice that muscle of thinking about, if you interact with your biology or your chemistry or the physical elements, they're all going to affect each other piece of your soil health. If nothing else, look at your soil organic matter. I hope we have convinced you today that soil organic matter can really tell you leaps and bounds if you're not ready to commit to the full soil health test. Know the purpose. Why are you taking your test? Otherwise, you might be disappointed to realize that you're not quite sure what to do with it. And as in the last examples, not all illnesses have a cure. So we might not yet have a perfect soil solution for your soil health situation, but we can try to give you some best management practices to follow, and then check in a few years and see if we're seeing the desired results. And last but not least, don't be shy to realize that right now there's a major human element to reading these tests. A soil fertility test, we genuinely have formulas. We can spit out very consistent interpretations. But if I look at a test and someone else looks at a test, we might come up with different interpretations. It doesn't mean anyone's wrong or did anything bad. We just have different experience and we see different things, and that's okay. So with that, I'll back out of the screen share, and Joe and I can field any questions. And also shout out to Caro and Julie, who are on and are very knowledgeable about soil health, and Jim Height is also on, who is very knowledgeable about all things pasture. So please don't hesitate to direct questions to them too.
So we had a few questions come through, and in the next few minutes, if we can address some things that haven't already been answered by a few other participants, that would be great. The first question would be thoughts on adding leaves to degraded fields.
Well, I'm going to get myself in trouble with this one. This is where I'm going to start by saying that people have different opinions, and I might kick it back over to someone like Caro and Julie. Some people feel very strongly that you should not add leaves to compost or fields because they are not particularly nutrient dense. The reason being is that when trees drop their leaves, trees are wonderfully evolved creatures, and they suck most of those nutrients back into the body of the tree so that they can use that for next year's growth. And so what that means is there is not a ton of nutrients in those leaves. I've also heard the claim that leaves can increase acidity. I don't know if that's true or not, so I'll just say that. I'll just say I've heard that. I will tell you that my own personal no-till garden is absolutely mounded with leaves right now. So I like leaves. I think they are a way to add in a lot of carbon, but you just have to know that you might have some trade-offs with that, and what can those leaves actually provide to you.
I think the thing I would add to that is just that they often tie up nitrogen. So you just have to know that you're adding organic matter, but it's not a balanced nutrient profile that'll break down quickly. So it's just sort of something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think the person asking that question was mentioning that their alpaca are not adding the organic matter in the form of poop back to the field because alpaca, if I remember correctly, like poop in one spot like rabbits. So so could you just try mixing their manure with leaves if you have an abundance of leaves and composting them together and then putting that back on the field instead? That would be my suggestion.
Yeah, Kara, I think I've heard that too, that they kind of have an outhouse area and they stick to it. That's a really good point.
Yeah, so I think that was why the manure wasn't being returned.
Yeah, I'd asked the question because we've had pigs in a pen for a very long time, and with erosion and them rooting, between like the outside fence line and the inside fence line, we have like a good 6-inch drop. And you know, with COVID, we were like, oh, do we add soil? And we have an abundance of leaves that have to get raked up because they're in public areas. So my thought was, give it to the pigs, they'll root around with it. It'll eventually break down, and not very quickly, but hopefully add a little bit more into their pasture. But I didn't know if I was just being, I just want to make sure I wasn't being, causing more issues than.
That sounds like a good application.
Yeah.
The only thing that I would keep in mind is just obviously how much, like how thick of a layer of leaves you put down. So I really like them for weed suppression. You know, they're free mulch. But if you do get a thick mat of leaves, like you said, if you're incorporating them with pigs, I think that would work great. But if you have an existing pasture, you might accidentally kill your grass if they're too thick.
Oh yeah, there's no grass in there.
Okay, great. Then you're perfect.
We have time for one more question. I know there are some other questions listed in our chat, and I will promise each of those people who have asked a specific question that I will get you in contact with those folks who can answer those questions for you. But we're going to wrap up today with the last question from Marianne that says, thoughts on pasture management in light of groundwater? Is terracing a technique that is worth considering?
Joe, do you want to go with that one?
I'm sorry, I was reading the chat box and only halfway paying attention to be real honest.
The question was terracing and a concern about groundwater. Is that right, Rachel?
Yep. Is terracing a technique that may be worth considering, Joe, in the sense of pasture management with groundwater implications? I
mean, it's certainly an opportunity. I mean, I think the question is how will you do it? You know, what kind of mechanics are involved in making the terraces? You know, and what advantage do you ultimately gain? I don't have a lot of familiarity with terracing, to be honest. And so I guess the main thing that I would say is that my mind goes more toward just managing different species, managing different grazing patterns that move in and out of higher, lower areas, wetter, drier areas. And my mind goes more to animal movement than actually just trying to make the land all similar. But that's just me.
Yeah, I'd also want to know what your you know, I'd love to see what the soil hardness and subsurface hardness looks like. If your concern, I'm assuming maybe is about, the contamination of your groundwater, that could be managed through, limiting nutrients, right? Avoiding nutrient excesses, applying nutrients at a rate at which your plants can take up most of them. But yeah, there are, like we know if we put down nitrogen, most of the time plants only get about 50% of it and the rest is lost. So I think before you go to something like terracing, maybe that would be a good opportunity for some diagnostic and some risk assessment to see if that's going to best target your concerns.
So in interest of keeping us somewhat on time, I'm going to wrap up today, but like I said, I do promise to get all of the questions that are in the chat, and feel free to continue putting them in. I will get you as a participant in contact with somebody who can address your questions. But at this point, I'd like to wrap up with just a few small points in closing. One, I'd like to thank our speakers and all of our moderators today for your work, your time, and your energy. It is much appreciated, so thank you very much. Second, if you don't already know or are not already aware, we do have one last webinar as part of this series that is coming up on April 19th. It is a Tuesday. Again, it will be from 10 to 12 in the 10 a.m. to 12 noon. It will be our third webinar and final webinar in the series. We will be talking about making some positive change and ways to increase soil quality. So certainly if you are not already signed up, please go ahead and sign up either on our website or contact me directly and we can make sure we get you registered. And lastly, well, I guess two more things. Sorry about that. One, I did just see that Francis posted our post-evaluation session questions that we do ask you to answer. These will help give us some direction and some knowledge for moving forward with different programming that we put on. So again, much like the pre-evaluation questions, go ahead and click on the link, answer the series of questions there, and just hit submit at the bottom. While you're doing that, and lastly, before we send everybody off today, I did just want to give everybody a little note to looking ahead for summer programming. We are in the midst of planning a summer tour through southern New England with a soil health trailer. There'll be several locations that you can join in on a workshop. We are finalizing those details right now, but as soon as those are finalized, we will be sending out some information and a way to register for those. So certainly keep an eye out on that. And with that, I have no further comments today. Certainly if there is anything, please post it in the chat. We will make sure we get everything addressed. I appreciate you taking the time to fill out our post-evaluation survey. And we will hopefully see you all again on April 19th. Thanks for joining.